everyone! In today's video I wanted to go over some container gardening tips that I didn't know when I started, but when I learned them, they were incredibly obvious. Like, so obvious it blew my mind that my brain hadn't already realized these things. So some of these tips you might know, and some of them you might not, and might have one of those mind-blowing experiences like I did. So I wanted to share these because, again, when you're starting off doing something new, you don't even know the basics or the really simple solutions to some of the problems that you're facing. So I'm hoping some of these can be helpful. If all of you already knew all of these, just let me know in the comments how silly I've been then not knowing them. So the first one on my list, which is kind of the one that brings back the first time this happened and one of the funniest stories, is you can rotate your containers. So I had planted in one of my 30-gallon grow bags, I think it was last year, a pepper plant, a bell pepper plant in a bag, and then in the front of the grow bag I put 3 marigolds. Now at this time I had only ever seen marigolds that got maybe 6 inches tall max. So when these hit 6 inches and then a foot and then 2 feet, I got a little concerned and decided to look at the seed pack, which said giant marigolds. And that's when I learned that I can grow 4 to 5 feet tall marigolds in my garden. But the problem was, so the grow bag is facing the back of the deck. It's where my tomato plants are right now. So the marigolds had grown up and were blocking basically all the sun from hitting the pepper plant. So I asked on Instagram and I said, hey, anything I can do, or should I just dig up these marigolds and replant them? And someone responded and said, why don't you just turn the container around? And I was like, what? I never thought of that. I mean, I've moved my containers from spot to spot, but I've never just shifted one in its own place. So that's what I did. And yes, even the 30-gallon ones, I can drag around and move on my own. So I basically just twisted the bag around so that the marigolds were in the back and the pepper plant was in the front. Now, the pepper plant did die on its own, so I did end up pulling that, but it was not related to the marigolds. But that was one of those moments that I was like, how did I not think of the simplest solution? So now, not only do I turn containers if something like that were to happen, but I turn them almost all of the time. So some of my dahlias, for example, will have really beautiful bloom, but it's facing the back. So I just twist the container around so that I get the best view of the bloom in my garden. And that's now when I'm turning my containers the most. I think there's some other instances where I could turn my containers. So for example, the ones on my flower cart, the sun hits them just on the front, so the front half of the plant looks really great. I could turn those if I wanted to get sun more evenly, but it's definitely when I'm turning the ones with the bloom. So sunflowers, dahlias, zinnias pretty much bloom all around, but anything that has a really pretty bloom that's facing the back, I turn around and face the front, which means I'm turning it fairly often, I'd say, throughout the growing season. Now you do want to be careful. If you have any drip in it, I will have to pick up the drip and just move it to a different space in a container. Obviously there's some heavy containers like my elevated beds right here that I'm not able to move those. But if you have any smaller containers that you can turn on your own, turn your containers if you ever need to. So that was my first tip that was definitely mind-blowing to me. The second tip is that sometimes you may need to water even if it has rained. So what happened in this instance was we got rain, I think it was early last spring, pretty regularly throughout the spring season. So like almost every day, every other day, I barely had to hand water my garden. But I noticed that my raspberry plant was starting to droop. And I thought, well, there's no way that could be from lack of rain. There must be something else wrong with it. And I went out and the soil was actually dry. And that's because when you're growing in containers, if you have a plant that kind of creates a leaf canopy, that can prevent water from getting to your soil, which again, should be fairly obvious, but not something I thought of. So if you do have any plants like that where they're pretty thickly covered in leaves, or the container's really small and maybe even just a few leaves are blocking the rain from getting in, go ahead and give them a water even if it's rained. This tends to happen, I feel like, more later in the season too as plants get larger, but the ones I can think of off the bat that it happens with are my raspberry plant, my hydrangeas will do that, this one particular rhubarb plant right there, because the leaves cover the container pretty well. So plants like that where you're getting a lot of leaf canopy over the container, just make sure even if it is raining that you check and see if they need to be watered. Next is to put anything that's heavy, so like a heavy container or even, for example, raised beds on wheels. This is something I have not done, but something I want to do, especially for my blueberry and raspberry bushes, which are in heavier, larger containers. I actually was at one of the local garden centers the other day and saw they make trays with wheels specifically for this. Had I thought of this before, I could have put wheels with locks on them on my elevated beds, although I don't think I would have really moved those around in the garden because it's not like there's a lot of space for them to go to. But that was, again, something that I think was recommended to me on Instagram when I was complaining about moving my pots around, and they were like, why don't you put it on wheels? And again, it was mind blown that that was something I had never thought of. So like I said, this is something I've now seen in garden centers. I don't know if it's been around for a while and I just never noticed it. I'm sure they have things online that are similar. So if you want little platforms with wheels on them, get those for your very heavy containers that either you just want to move around throughout the garden for, I don't know, whatever reason you might have, but especially when moving it in for the winter. So here, most of my plants that I keep outside, I just shift over closer to the house during winter, but it still would be nice even for a few feet to just be able to push and wheel it over. Next on my list that is very important is to make sure that pots are draining. Now that means first making sure that there is a drainage hole in your pot somewhere, but my issue came was because I just assumed that if something had a drainage hole, it would actively be draining. And sometimes I've had things get clogged up, especially when I was using a soil that had a lot of larger bark pieces that were kind of sticking where the hole was, or if the hole was smaller on the container. It was one of those things where I was like, oh, well, there's a hole in it. I'm sure it drains. But unless I actually saw water draining out of the bottom when I watered it, I did lose some plants that weren't draining at all or as well as they should have been, just because something was blocking the drainage hole at the bottom. So if there is an issue with your plants, I noticed it because I was getting root rot and I didn't know why, and then I realized that there was stuff stuck to the bottom that I had to get out with my finger. So I would say just double check that your pots are actually draining, but also go ahead and double check that your pots do have drainage holes. I know there's been some times where I'll buy a pot from a garden center specifically, and in my head I'll just assume, because I got it from a garden center, that it has a drainage hole. And then I plant something without actually checking, and then later realize there is no drainage hole. To be fair, that happens more often with my houseplants than my garden pots as well, just because I don't have as many, I'd say, like, nice, pretty pots in my garden as I do for my houseplants, but something you want to check for all of your containers, especially in the garden when things are getting rained on and watered much more than your houseplants would be, is that you have adequate drainage in your containers. Next on my list is to fertilize more often than you would if you were gardening in the ground, even for things that say they don't need fertilizer. So when I was just getting started with some of my plants, I would do a lot of research online how to best grow them, and a lot of the things I was reading said, this plant XYZ doesn't need to be fertilized. And I was like, great, I'll go ahead and not fertilize that. And then I realized I was reading care tips specifically for planting in the ground, or it wasn't specific to growing in containers. So that's something I've now started doing is, one, when I'm research specifically for how to grow X in a pot or how to grow X in a container, and not just how to grow X, because there might be some best practices that are necessary for containers that aren't necessary if you're growing it in the ground. Now, one of the things I tested this year was I have some herbs that say they like terrible poor soil, which again, great, I can give you that. But I have been fertilizing them, not as often as my other herbs, but I'd say still about once a month, and they're green and they're beautiful. Now, I can't say, I guess, for sure that they wouldn't be green and beautiful without the fertilizer, but the fertilizer, I think, is definitely keeping them in good shape, especially since those are in 8-inch diameter containers. So it's much smaller than a larger container, or obviously growing it in the ground. So if you are growing in containers, I would say, I'm trying to think if there's anything here that I don't fertilize. I don't think there is, just looking around. I'd say the ones I fertilize the least, I was going to say my raspberries and blueberries. I think when I was researching those, it said to fertilize just once, kind of around springtime, but my raspberry definitely I have had to fertilize maybe about once a month, just to keep the leaves green. I noticed that the leaves were yellowing, some of them were turning brown, and when I just applied an all-purpose fertilizer, they went right back to green. Now my blueberries, I don't apply too much fertilizer to, but I do need to apply soil acidifier, because again, I'm growing these in containers. They like acidic soil, The soil in the containers itself isn't acidic, so I need to keep adding that acidifier because they get watered fairly regularly. So anytime you're growing in a container, you're going to need to add more nutrients than you would growing in the ground, typically. My next tip is again one that should seem fairly obvious, but that is that you can look specifically for dwarf or miniature varieties of plants. I don't know if there's always been as many kind of smaller plant varieties, or if maybe that's something that as gardening has become more popular, especially in urban areas, that there's more availability of those now. But I never thought to look in the first couple years of growing things in my garden for dwarf varieties or miniature varieties. And then when I started doing that, I realized there were plants that I could fit much better into my space, especially plants that maybe I don't love enough to really want a full-size plant. So the example I can think of is for my tomatoes, my cherry tomatoes, love them. So I would rather grow a full-size, indeterminate cherry tomato plant and give more of my space in my garden to that. Whereas the eggplant, which I still enjoy, I just don't love as much as my tomatoes, I got a patio baby. That was on accident, I didn't realize, but I'm glad I did. But I got a patio baby variety, which was smaller in stature and produced small, cute little eggplants. So you can be on the lookout for smaller varieties of your favorite plants. Kind of at the top of my list right now is to get miniature varieties of fruit trees, because I would love to have fruit trees in my garden, especially apple or peach, and I want to be able to add those, but also not have a full tree growing up here, although I do think that would be cool. I just don't know if the wind would let it live up here. Might be getting some small evergreens, I think I mentioned that before, but I would also love to have like a tricolor beech up here. Anyway, now I'm getting distracted from the topic at hand. But that is, especially if you have like a smaller balcony than what I have, because this is pretty large, I'd say, for a balcony, so small for a garden, large for a balcony garden, 18 by 19 square feet. So looking at miniature dwarf varieties of the plants. Like I said, had the eggplant, I have a dwarf blueberry, 2 even tinier blueberries, and then I have, what else do I have? Oh, I have the 2 tiny hydrangeas that I just got from the Grand Garden Show. So I'm just excited to try out these varieties of smaller plants in my garden that just frees up more space for more smaller plants. Next on my list is something I've shown you before in my kind of how I keep my garden alive while I'm out of town, but this ties back into the fact that you can move your containers. And that is, if you're going out of town, move your containers, even if they are full sun-loving plants, assuming you aren't going to be out of town for like a month, but move them to the shade, because that way they're going to hold on to the moisture much longer than they would be in full sun, especially if you don't have somebody coming over to either check on your plants every day, water your plants every day. Even when we were going out of town just for a weekend, if I know I had plants in my garden that need to be watered every day when they're in the full sun, but I did not have set up to drip, I would move those over to the shade and they would survive, even for like a 2 to 3 day length of time that we were gone. So again, if you're going to be gone for a month, probably don't move your sun-loving plants into the shade, but if you're going to be gone for like a few days to a week, push them over to the shade. They'll probably not need to be watered the entire time you're gone. Another tip, which isn't something that I've had too much of an issue with, or really don't think I've had any issue with in my garden with the containers that I have right now, but I have had in the past, and that is if you live in a very hot climate, or you know your garden gets very hot, is to go more towards lighter colored containers compared to darker colored containers. Obviously with darker colored containers, that's going to absorb more heat, and your roots are growing right along the container. So if the container gets really hot, that can burn the roots. So I had that happen with a smaller plastic container is really the issue that I had it with, where I would touch the container in the full sun and it would hurt my fingers. So if it's hurting my fingers, probably not great for the roots of the plant. I do have my 3 black grow bags, but those, I think because the material is so porous and thin, it doesn't really heat up, but I would keep that in mind, especially, I mean, we're not in a terribly hot climate. It just gets, I think, hotter up here than it would in a normal garden in zone 6A, because we're on a rooftop, it's very condensed, it's getting a lot of the very intense sun in the afternoon, so it heats up a lot more than I think other gardens would here. But if you're in a higher zone than that, where it gets a lot hotter than Chicago, that's something that you might want to keep in mind. So I have a lot of brown pots, I have, oh my gosh, almost all my pots are brown. I have a lot of beige grow bags, and again, the only 3 ones that I have are black, are my large grow bags. Never had an issue with black grow bags. have had issues with other types of black containers. So something just to keep in mind. And my last tip for this video is just something I kind of realized as I was searching for these beds right here. And that is, if you are in a situation like me, where if you're looking for containers, you want a container with a bottom, like an enclosed bottom on it, instead of searching for raised beds, which are oftentimes just the four walls because they're meant to be put on the ground, search for elevated beds. That has returned much better results, because when I was first shopping for raised beds, I almost bought a bed without a bottom, which means it would be sitting on my deck, and I don't think that would be the best for my deck, to have just layers of soil directly on top of it without being in a container. So look for elevated beds, and then those should have legs on them, should have a covered bottom, and that way it'll actually contain your soil and not be sitting directly onto your deck. Now, if anyone's ever tried to have their soil sitting directly on their deck, let me know how it's gone. I just don't know how I would ever manage with that. So elevated beds instead of raised beds when you are searching online for a type of container for a deck or balcony garden. And I think that's going to be everything for this video. I'm sure there are a bunch more tips that I didn't think of, but these were the ones that when they first came to mind, I was like, oh, yeah, that would make sense. How have I not thought of that before? So hopefully by sharing these tips, if it was something that you didn't know, you've learned something. And if there are other tips that you have for container gardens that maybe should be obvious or weren't as obvious, or just tips that you've gathered along the way, let me know in the comments below, and then that way we can all share them. And I'm sure there are tons more to learn. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.